Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's announcement of a debt relief of 254 billion rand for Eskom has been widely welcomed. Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan says this will allow the utility to utilize cash from operations to increase its maintenance budget. Eskom says it will now study the details of that plan. We're now joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study, Dr. Sean Muller. Dr. Muller, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. I think overshadowing the budget today, at least, is the explosive allegations made by the former CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter. How things changed in less than 24 hours. He's since resigned yesterday with immediate effect. The ANC coming out today indicating that they are in talks with their lawyers, giving him 7 to 10 days to actually name and shame the people he says are using Eskom as a feeding trough. What have you made of all the happenings around this in the past day or so?
Yes, well, I think it was a little bit surprising to me that after de Ruyter's resignation, he was kept on for a substantial notice period. He'd failed really in his main task, which was to reduce the severity of load shedding, and one can obviously debate where the blame for that lies. He argues it lies elsewhere. Some people argue that it lies with him. I think there are also questions about whether he was out of his depth. Technically, he certainly didn't have a background in energy, and he'd only really managed private sector organizations. But one thing that I think is pretty clear is that he was out of his depth politically, and that's reflected in the kinds of statements that he's made. He wasn't particularly well suited to operating a state-owned enterprise where there are these complicated political considerations. When I say complicated political situations, I'm not referring to the corruption that he alleges, but one has to answer to a number of different, effectively answer to a number of different ministries, even if one officially has one particular minister to whom one is supposed to answer. And there are various kinds of complicated dynamics within the governing party, the ANC, which he didn't seem particularly well suited to deal with. So in that sense, it's not entirely surprising. I would like to mention one thing, which is there have been a lot of stories in the media about potential surveillance of Mr. de Ruyter and other kinds of things, but the only specific incident that has been independently looked at was the one about a tracking device in his vehicle, and that turned out apparently to be a tracking device put there by the vehicle manufacturer and not by some shadowy intelligence agency as he'd alleged. But many of the media outlets that reported the first story did not report the second.
And so all these shenanigans that the poisoning, which he alluded to in that interview, these sideshows that are happening, these complicated dynamics that are happening, are ultimately having an impact on you and I. Small businesses are folding, and not just small businesses. I think the everyday person is struggling to cope with the persistent load shedding, also making it known that come winter, things may even get worse. And so these shenanigans that are happening, are we just sitting here, South Africans, as helpless observers in terms of just watching things deteriorate in the country?
Right. I think by and large, actually, that is the case. But, even though I had my own qualms about Mr. de Ruyter's suitability for the post, my view was still, given that he'd been appointed, he should be given a chance to try and do the job. And I think he failed to do so. I think a more cynical view, though, is that actually Mr. de Ruyter has in some sense succeeded in doing the job that some people would have wanted him to do, which is to bring Eskom to the point of such a crisis that certain policies that these interests would like to be pushed through could now be pushed through with this kind of background, with a sense of urgency, formally declaring a disaster, and basically opening up the regulatory space for these policies to be pushed through. And I think we also see that in terms of, to link it to the budget, which I know you want to talk about. The budget uses the debt relief to Eskom in order to push certain conditions onto Eskom and further advance the process of splitting Eskom up. Essentially, in some sense, well, this is a strong turn of phrase, but destroying Eskom as it used to be. Interestingly, one media house is reporting that one of the conditions is that Eskom must concession its coal-fired power stations. Now, that's interesting because perhaps I missed it, but I didn't see that in the minister's speech, and I didn't see it in the budget review. But it's the kind of information that gets leaked to certain media houses in order to ensure that these particular interests continue to advance. And I think it's quite plausible that that's one of the conditions. So in essence, there's an attempt to stop Eskom from being a primary energy producer and to get Eskom to facilitate the operations of private sector interests, whether those are based on new generation capacity or taking over Eskom's existing generation capacity. So to come back to your question in terms of what South Africans can do, are they just helpless observers? Well, by and large, yes. One of the interesting things is that the kinds of policies that the current government appears to be pushing through the splitting up of Eskom, through these kinds of conditionalities, through appointing somebody like Mr. Ruyter, who's overseen Eskom reaching the stage that it has, whether it's his fault or somebody else's, all of those kinds of things that have been done are actually supported, as far as I can tell, by most opposition parties. So there's this narrative also that if one were to change the government, these things would change. Actually, no. These particular measures, the kinds of measures that are being proposed by the Treasury, the kinds of measures that are being proposed in relation to renewable energy, reducing regulatory requirements for renewable energy whilst keeping them very high for other energy sources, all these kinds of things are likely to carry on regardless of which political party is in power. So if one thinks about democracy as being choosing between different parties that have different policies, there's not much that South Africans unfortunately can do in that respect either, as far as I can see.
The finance minister under climate change also noted that through the Just Transition Investment Plan launched by the president in 2022 at COP27, the country will make significant investments in our economy over the next 5 years, supported by a coherent industrial policy to enable innovation and economic diversification. Is it clear to you what this industrial policy is, number one? He also mentioned the International Partners Group that pledged some $8.5 billion US, which is something that the Ruyter mentioned in his interview. This is the money that he alleges that the party wants to use to further their interests next year. So I guess the second question being, how then do we ensure accountability on monitoring around the use of these monies that are being pledged for South Africa to move away or to move to the just energy transition?
Well, just to stick more closely to the topic of this interview, we can talk about the industrial policy if we have time, but I could say, no, it's not clear to me precisely what they envisage with that policy. But let's talk about the 8.5 billion. There was a lot of hype about that in some initial reporting, which was premature. It turned out that the 8.5 billion was very much based around concessional loans, which in terms even of the lending patterns of the countries involved weren't even necessarily very concessionary. And this is a kind of pattern. So instead of these wealthy countries giving the money to developing countries, which arguably need it in order to pursue the energy transition in a just way. So we shouldn't have a situation where developing countries are paying disproportionately for this transition, given that so-called developed countries have contributed to it to a greater degree. So it's important to understand that that's the context, is that there's this need to address the issue of global warming. There are costs involved, and there's a question as to how those costs will be distributed internationally. And the basis for this kind of loan is actually that it's not reasonable to expect countries like South Africa to pay a large amount in order for this transition to happen. So wealthier countries need to assist. This is not just a charity case, right? But in that context, one could argue that what's most appropriate is direct transfers. So make the 8.5 billion a transfer to South Africa. And sure, put some conditions on it in as much as it's linked to this issue of the just transition. But in fact, it's been appears to have been structured in the form of concessionary loans, which are not necessarily that favorable and which potentially come with conditions that really reflect some level of overreach in terms of trying to determine how South Africa implements its energy transition. So a lot of the hype around that 8.5 billion was excessive. It's also interesting that given the amount of money that is flowing around Eskom and given the statements that have been made about corruption within the organization and in certain power stations, that now the claimed concern about corruption is shifting to this amount of money, the transfer which has not even been secured, and the terms, as far as I know, have not been decided. So again, in that sense, it's kind of speculative. I mean, certainly I don't want to rule out the possibility that there are ANC politicians involved in corruption. We know for a fact that that has been true in the past. The state capture inquiry revealed that. There have been other revelations in relation to the arms deal in the past and so forth. Where the ANC is unique in that respect, as Mr. de Ruyter seems to imply, is another matter, in as much as it's not necessarily clear that, again, if another party were to get into power and they were to have access to the same levers, whether they would not also engage in similar kinds of corruption. We have some evidence at provincial and municipal level that, in fact, other political parties sometimes behave in similar kinds of ways. But, yes, when it comes to that 8.5 billion, I think it has partly been a distraction, even though it should be an important component of South Africa's transition, in as much as we get the transfer to pay for the transition, which I've argued in some of our separate interviews, is at the moment most likely going to be paid for by so-called ordinary South Africans, while wealthy individuals, large private interests and so forth actually end up paying less than they should.
Also, there's tax rebates for those who can install solar up to 15,000 rand. That was announced. We may not have a CEO for now while they're still deciding who to put into that position in the interim. And then we're also waiting for the announcement on the electricity minister. And so the interventions that were announced by the finance minister, are they welcome to you, at least in terms of the money that will go towards Eskom?
Well, I think there's been actually quite a broad agreement that some kind of arrangement needs to be made in relation to Eskom's debt. Because in effect, first of all, Eskom is part of the broader public sector balance sheet. And if Eskom is paying more than necessary for its debt, then that means that South Africans are paying more than necessary to Eskom, one way or another, whether it's through electricity tariffs or whether it's through taxes or whatever it is. It was clear that also the extent of the debt was impinging on Eskom's operations. It had accumulated it for historical reasons, largely relating to the investment in Medupi and Kusile, which, as we know, have also come online excessively late. So there was a sense in which it made sense to find some kind of arrangement to deal with Eskom's debt. And I think, to be fair, one of the reasons for the delay is because it's not a straightforward thing to do, and the amounts of money are quite large. So to the extent that some kind of arrangement has been set up, and from what I can see, it seems reasonable. There was some talk about, for example, using public servants' pensions as one way of reducing Eskom's debt, but I think it was found that legally that wasn't possible. It was going to be very complicated. So this is the approach that's been taken. It seems all right in that sense. But the devil is in the detail, and part of the detail relates to the conditions. So, and this is very interesting in terms of the broader public policy space and public finance space, because one of the concerns about the Treasury since 1994 is there's been essentially meddling in policy issues that are not its business. Now, when you talk to Treasury officials about this, or former Treasury officials, they'll deny it. But this is a nice example, because the budget is proposed. By the way, this is a proposal. None of this has been passed. Parliament still has to conduct oversight over the budget and actually approve it or not approve it. It can also amend the budget, right? This is another thing. So in the past, it's quite common to report on the budget as something that's fait accompli, it's something that's done. But in fact, it still needs to go to Parliament. It still needs to be approved. So in that sense, and if South Africans have concerns, they should try and involve themselves in the parliamentary process. Not that there's much evidence that makes a difference, but legally, that's how the process is supposed to work in our democracy. So the structure of the amounts seems reasonable. But as I mentioned earlier in the interview, there have been reports. There's, first of all, the stated conditionalities in the budget, which are quite thin, actually. The minister says in his speech that the details are provided in one of the annexures. I've looked in the annexure. There's not a lot of detail there. What's also interesting, if I focus in on one particular issue, is that the annexure and I think the speech talk about Eskom prioritizing investment in transmission, whereas there's a media report that says that actually Eskom will be prevented from engaging in any future generation investment, and furthermore will be required to concession its coal-fired power stations. So that's an example of the Treasury using conditionalities attached to funding to push a particular approach to energy policy and the future structure of Eskom in a way that one could argue isn't really appropriate given Treasury's mandate. Having said that, what it also reflects is the complicated political situation, because there is a sense in which there's been a deadlock between some of the ministers, the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Public Enterprises, the Minister of Environment. And so what this could reflect is the broader intention of cabinets, maybe the ANC, particularly the President, to essentially use the budget and use the Treasury to cut through that indecision to push this particular agenda. Now, on the one hand, that's quite savvy from a political point of view. The problem is it might not be the best approach. I'm not convinced, and I've been saying this really for the last 5 years, I'm really not convinced that prioritizing breaking up Eskom is in fact what should have been done. I think it's part of the reason why we've reached this crisis stage, is because the priority of people like Andre de Ruyter was splitting up Eskom. And I think he's made some good progress on that. It's just unfortunate and not coincidental, I think, that in doing so, he's overseen Eskom reaching this particular stage of crisis, which, as you say, is affecting all South Africans in quite a serious way.
Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, Dr. Sean Muller. Thank you.